So hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon for our series Behind the Headlines. This time we are focusing on Burkina Faso's spiraling crisis, the humanitarian emergency in Burkina Faso. And I'm delighted to be joined by a very diverse panel of people. We have journalists, humanitarians, and political analysts. My name is Philip Kleinfeld. I am an editor and correspondent at the New Humanitarian. Normally based out of Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. But today I am joining you from London. No, not London, I'm actually on the coast, sorry, in the United Kingdom, where like most of the world, we are currently in a coronavirus lockdown. I'm sure you don't need me telling you, but obviously coronavirus is stealing the headlines at the moment, and TNH journalists and reporters and editors have been working round the clock to make sure that we have countries and issues that are important to our audiences covered at the moment. Yesterday, we published a story by Sam Mednick, who is our correspondent in Burkina Faso, looking at what happens when you bring together the world's fastest growing displacement crisis with a public health disaster, a situation where healthcare centers are closing as cases are rising, where doctors and nurses are among the thousands of people fleeing every single day. Coronavirus is obviously an issue of profound importance to Burkina Faso and to humanitarians that are responding to the emergency. And it would be remiss of us not to talk about what is happening in this conversation. But I'd also like to be mindful that there are other issues that are happening in Burkina Faso right now, from a growing IDP crisis to spiraling militancy. And those are the issues I'd really like to focus our discussion on today. And to get a sort of insight into these issues, I am joined by Sam Mednick, who is our excellent correspondent based in Ouagadougou. I'm joined by two humanitarians, Dr. Menengi Mangundu, who is the Burkina Faso and Niger country director at the Norwegian Refugee Council, Jackie McLeod, who is the Burkina Faso country director for the International Rescue Committee. And I'm also joined by Siaka Koulibaly, who is a political analyst that many Burkina Faso will be used to seeing on their TV screens and on the airwaves. So we're pleased to have him with us today. At the end of the discussion, hopefully we'll have some time for some questions from the audience. And I'm told that you can use Zoom's Q&A feature to ask essentially whatever is on your mind, and we'll sort of sort through them and try and target them to different panelists at the end of the conversation. Before cracking on, I thought I'd try and give a little bit of context to the crisis in Burkina Faso for those of you that might not be as informed as our panelists. Burkina Faso is a country that has gone through coups, political assassinations, revolutions. It's gone through its sort of fair share of events since independence. It's not necessarily always been a stable country, but it has broadly been a peaceful one. It was well known and well regarded within West Africa for pluralism, tolerance, coexistence, diversity, and so on. With the present crisis, a lot of that is being put into question. A small sort of band of Islamist militants started launching attacks in Burkina Faso in late 2015. And fast forward to today, and that sort of small band has morphed into Al-Qaeda and Islamic State linked groups, and a really, a fully blown kind of grassroots insurgency. It's one of the fastest growing insurgencies, Islamist type insurgencies in the world, and it's provoked and triggered one of the world's fastest displacement crises, or, quickest displacement crises. The militants have wriggled their way into parts of Burkina Faso in the north and the east, and also the southwest, that puts them within touching distance of a number of countries along West Africa's coastline, the Gulf of Guinea, as well. And they have tapped into a set of, they have manipulated communal and ethnic grievances, which sort of testing the foundations of society in Burkina Faso, as also in Mali. neighboring Mali. I first went to the country in 2018 when there were a few thousand displaced people. It was really the first signs that the security crisis was morphing into a humanitarian crisis. I visited the north and the east, where civilians were increasingly being targeted, whereas first it was soldiers and government officials. It was increasingly religious leaders, educators, teachers, anyone really that differed from the authority of the jihadist groups. I went back to the country in 2019. There were 150,000 people displaced in early 2019. I spoke to UN officials. They told me by the end of the year, in a worst case scenario, 360,000 people would be displaced. Well, they were lowballing. By the end of 2019, 560,000 people were displaced. And the number just keeps growing every single day. It's now nearly 800,000, and it just shows no signs at all of slowing. The scale of the crisis, the rapid descent has caught a lot of humanitarian actors seemingly off guard. And more fundamentally, it's uprooted the lives of Burkina Faso civilians. So that's a little introduction. Before kicking off the conversation, I'd like to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves, to say a little bit about who you are, who you work for, and what you're currently doing in Burkina Faso, very quickly. And I'd like you to answer an initial question for me. And I'm afraid I'm going to ask the most negative one first, which is, is the scale of the crisis likely to deteriorate further? And if so, how bad can it get? And I'd like to direct my question first to Jackie McLeod.
Thank you for having us on this call today for this important topic. As you said, my name is Jackie McLeod. I am the country director here in Burkina Faso for the International Rescue Committee. So in terms of the first question of what we are doing here, what our interventions are, so we are currently intervening in water, sanitation, and hygiene, health and nutrition programming, and we're in 3 regions of the country. So we're in Sahel, Nord, and Boucle de Mouhoun. Very soon, hopefully, we're pending a few signed agreements from donors. We will be expanding our programming to child protection as well. So we're looking to continue to just expand, not so much geographically, because we already know, or we see that we're in some of the areas of greatest need, but really to deepen our interventions in those areas that we are already present in. In terms of your question, how bad can it get, or do we see that it's getting worse, or in the opinion of the humanitarian community? I mean, quite frankly, I think we need to look at this in the context of what you have just said, right? So last year at this time, 150,000 internally displaced people. Now we are nearing 800,000, and that number was tipping before COVID-19 arrived here. So we have crisis layered upon crisis, and a very fragile health system, a system that's not really equipped, especially in parts of the country, which I just mentioned, where most humanitarian actors are intervening. So systems that are not equipped to be able to deal with this crisis. So even without coronavirus, even without this pandemic, which is hitting the entire world very hard, you already have a population that's struggling to keep up, that's struggling to deal with the fact that there are 800,000 people displaced. And that also, I think, needs to be put in perspective of the fact that this is a very small country. 800,000 people is an enormous proportion of the population. It's not, it's not a lot, you think of the larger countries where it's not a small number to begin with, but this is an enormous displacement that keeps growing. So my answer, unfortunately, is not a very optimistic or one where we say, yeah, we think that we're going to be seeing a tipping point and things will start to get better. But as humanitarians, we do see entry points. We do see ways in which we can intervene. We do see places where we can make inroads, as long as humanitarian corridors remain open, as long as our access remains possible. But this virus, which has now hit us fast and hard, is making that more and more difficult. So that's my answer for now.
Thanks, Jackie. And Menenji, do you think, are you more or less optimistic than Jackie? How bad do you think things can get? And a quick introduction from you two, please. Menenji, your microphone is muted, so if you could just unmute and start again.
Perfect. All right, thank you. I'm Manoj Mangundu. I'm the country director for Norwegian Refugee Council. I think basically us as Norwegian Refugee Council, we started last year around September, focusing more on Sender North, doing wash, shelter, and we are looking at options to do legal documentation and also housing, land, and property. These are the things that we are looking in future to do, based on what we are observing, that people are on the movement, and then there are some restriction on movements. At the same time, sometimes people do not have documentation, and then they end up not moving. So yeah, we have activities that we have in the Central North, and then we wanted to move to Dori, which is in the Sahel, with the intention of expanding, doing our shelter programs and wash activities as well. And then we are also negotiating with some donors to see if we can do food security in Central and Sahel. I think for us as NRC, we see that Central North is more percentage in terms of number of IDPs as compared to the other regions, followed by Sahel. So that's kind of our focus at the moment as an organization. In terms of your questions, I think if you look at the way you describe the chronology of how the events turned up since last year up to the current, for example, I will use the official figures, which we have, which is around 779,000 from the last communication from CONASUR. I think they are on the rise. But I think as humanitarian actors, based on our discussions last year when we were doing the humanitarian response plan, I think we had quite projected up to 900,000. So we are to review to see whether we are going to reach 900,000 maybe in a couple of months to come, or we'll maintain that figure up to the end of the year. The biggest worry, I think, at the moment is the effects that we are starting to realize from COVID, and what does that mean, especially for both sides. Maybe, looking at the opposing forces in Sahel and also the government on the other side, how people react to that, and whether it will slow down or whether it will get worse. But in terms of humanitarian crisis, we are seeing that I think it will be a little bit worse, because I think also climate change is coming on board, whereas majority of the people, for example, those 800,000 people in displacement cannot access their land and so forth, which is also a big worry in terms of food security in those regions that are affected. So I think basically, I think those are the angles that we are looking at to see how best maybe we can work together with the government to ensure that we continue to have access to the affected people and continue to provide humanitarian assistance. The other worry that we have started to see maybe is the inter-community fighting, that are being reported in some areas, which would even escalate the number of people in displacement. But I think maybe let's hope there are some measures that are being done, because long back we used to know that Burkina Faso had this dialogue system that used to exist in the communities, and if that can be resuscitated, to ensure that communities continue to talk. I think that will at least help to cool down the friction and the tempers playing up between communities. So basically, I'm not optimistic. I think looking at the numbers where they are, I don't know whether I would say we hit more than 1 million in a couple of months or so, because I could see that maybe with the rate at which it had gone up, I think we are almost, the numbers are almost quite a lot at the moment.
So two rather pessimistic humanitarians. Siaka Koulibaly, you are a seasoned political analyst in Burkina Faso. You've been following the country for decades. I'm assuming this is the worst crisis you've seen. Do you think it's likely to get worse?
Yeah. Thank you very much for this panel. What I can say is that currently the situation is getting worse in Burkina Faso because the different crises are getting higher and higher. You have on one side the security issue, and also with the displaced people. And now you have this pandemic disease that is COVID-19. So the government is facing a lot of problems in the same time. On the political side also, we have a situation where we are in an electoral year. We have presidential and legislative elections in November. And because of this pandemic situation, I think the elections are going to be postponed for 1 or 2 years. And that is not an easy issue for the political class, because the opposition is sure that he is going to win the election, so they will not accept the postponement of this election. And what we did as the civil society actors, as also human rights defenders, is to call for a national dialogue, which we think is able to bring on the table all the main actors of the situation so that they can discuss the big issues of the country and find solutions for it.
Thank you, Siaka, who sort of points to a deteriorating political situation, potentially on top of a humanitarian situation as well. If you could just put your speaker onto mute, because I'm going to ask the question now to Sam. Sam, if you could answer the same question that I've asked to the other panelists, and also potentially shift us into the next question as well. Everyone has said, we've got this crisis and now coronavirus as well. This is obviously fast moving and most African countries are affected, but as things stand, Burkina Faso has the highest number of deaths in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think over 220 cases as well. You've been out there in Ouagadougou in recent days reporting for us on social distancing, preparedness plans. What's your 2 cents on that situation, and generally on where we stand now, and whether the situation in the security sense humanitarian and security sense might get worse too?
Yeah, so thanks for having me. I mean, I don't think I can paint a rosier picture than what everyone has painted so far, unfortunately. I've been covering this here for the past 6 weeks. I think that, like people have said, there was already an underlying humanitarian situation that was getting worse. The security was already getting worse, spreading from the Sahel in the north to the east and the west. Levels of recruitment from people I was speaking to from these groups exploiting local grievances was also getting worse. The levels of recruitment, the rate was rising from people that I spoke to people being, reports of people being recruited daily as opposed to reports of people being recruited weekly or even monthly. So I think the groundwork was already laid. It wasn't great. And now with Corona, unless this is reined in, which it doesn't look like it's going to be, it could potentially be a lot worse. The situation with Corona, from doctors I've spoken to, scientists, people involved with testing at the lab, paints a very grim picture of a weak medical system, a lack of community engagement right now. So while you do have people social distancing and doing their best, it's on the streets, it's pretty much life as usual. Mosques are closed, churches are closed, but you still see people praying in fairly large groups. You see people on motorbikes stacked on top of each other. So this is going to be take a long time to change. And given the rapid spread and contagion of the virus, it's, people I've spoken to have said that it's incredibly worrying. And then I think on the other side, the question is, how will the corona situation impact the security situation, and what, will these groups take advantage of that? Will this be an opportunistic opportunity for them to somehow come in? And people that I've spoken to have said it's too soon to tell, but pretty much within the next 2 weeks that maybe we'd be able to see, are there going to be more attacks? Are there going to, are people going to be taking advantage of the fact that everyone's distracted by corona? And take advantage of that? Are they going to try and sow more distrust among the population, maybe instigating even more, don't trust the government, come to us? These are some things that I've been speaking to analysts about that kind of say it should be on the lookout. So I think given the situation and given what's happening now, it unfortunately doesn't look, optimistic.
I guess militant groups have always tapped into the lack of legitimacy that the state has when it comes to delivering social services, and this is going to be a very good, it would be a very easy thing for them to do, to show, to undermine state legitimacy and show that they can't even offer basic healthcare. Is that what you're sort of suggesting?
Yeah, you already have people who are skeptical of the government, not necessarily, they don't trust them. People who are already going to traditional healers before they're going to go to the medical doctor or the health system. I think the concern is then these groups that are already exploiting local grievances for other things, about land, water, resources that people are already upset about. They're going to use this and say, oh, your government's not doing enough. This is a government conspiracy, or whatever the reason is that they use to further bring people onto their side. Okay, thanks, Sam. So not expecting the groups to heed the UN Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire. Siaka, Sam mentions a few issues there around social distancing and religious practices. I think it'd be great to hear from you. A lot of Burkina Faso depend on informal work, depend on getting out the house in order to earn a living. How would you see a sort of lockdown like we're seeing in Europe and other parts of the world working in a context like Burkina Faso? What are the sort of community challenges here?
Yeah, the community fights is part of the security situation in Burkina Faso, because it started by the activities of the terrorist groups, the jihadist groups in the Sahel. And after this, in 2018 or 2019, it started with the community fights among themselves. And we think that this second level of the security situation is the most difficult to solve. And we are not seeing the good sign from the government and to solve this issue. And actually, we think every group in Burkina Faso is getting ready to face these community fights.
Okay, so Siaka talks, you're speaking to sort of increase kind of community fractures. Just putting the question now to our humanitarians. Jackie, coronavirus, you mentioned in your sort of opening comments, you're already worried about it. Could you just give us your thoughts and let us know potentially, how it's impacting aid operations already?
Yeah, sure. Just a little backdrop on that too. So obviously, when we first had the first few cases here, I think I can speak for a lot of NGOs here, not just the International Rescue Committee, but we sprung into action in terms of putting in place plans for safe continuity of work, staff safety, the safety of our beneficiaries. So really looking at things like that we know work in situations like this, trying to procure PPE, making sure that we're ramping up IPC measures, infection prevention and control, enforcing social distancing and reinforcing or bolstering systems in our own offices and in the facilities where we work. So, you know, putting in hand washing stations, basically trying to buy any hand sanitizer that's left in the market, and you know, and getting that supply chain running. But one of the things that's really a challenge about this, as you ask, is the fact that it's not just Burkina Faso, but everywhere right now, borders are closed. So we're experiencing market ruptures or stock ruptures for a lot of the things that we need. One of those things is PPE. So we are, you know, we're putting in place right now, we're working in community messaging in these areas where we work to enforce social distancing, to talk about the importance of, you know, don't touch a friend. This is how this virus spreads, things like that. But the other thing that we do need are materials, and we need those materials to be available, one, and two, for us to be able to get them to where they need to go. So the second part of that, the availability is obviously, yeah, the supply chain has been difficult to activate here because airport is closed, land borders are also closed for the most part, and other countries around us are experiencing the same issue. But then also internally, there have been restrictions put in place on movements between Ouaga and these areas that we are all working in. So while we're not seeing a lot of cases yet, we also know that there's not testing there yet. So the challenge from the humanitarian perspective really is that, I mean, at least from the perspective of the International Rescue Committee, I will speak for us at the moment, but is that we do expect, or we do know how this virus spreads. The restrictions in movement were put in place after the eruption of the virus had been rampant throughout Ouaga for 15 days. Freedom of movement had already been occurring between all of the regions and the capital. So it's really a matter of when and not if we will start seeing cases in other parts of the country. And our ability to deliver any aid, not just aid for coronavirus, but any types of aid, is going to be hampered by this virus, frankly, because there are measures that do need to be put in place, common sense measures. Obviously, we can't just have unrestricted movement, people just kind of going around wherever they need to, but it's going to require a lot of coordination to make sure that essential services and supplies get to where they need to go to provide aid to the most vulnerable. And the most vulnerable really are outside of the capital, because the health systems in those areas are where they are the most fragile.
Thanks, Jackie. So quite a bleak picture. Burkina Faso may be doing too little too late, like a lot of other countries in the world, to prevent the spread of this virus. As I said at the beginning, I don't want to take all the time discussing coronavirus. So Dr. Menengi, I have a question for you that is slightly coronavirus related, but
can I add something
yes,
on coronavirus?
Please,
yeah. Like what Jackie said, it's not only Burkina Faso that is affected, but everywhere. That means supplies that used to come from those countries are affected. So if they used to depend on medicine from other countries that are heavily affected by coronavirus, we can't get them. And then the next aspect is we have our experienced humanitarian staff who are already holed up in those affected countries, and they cannot come out. So it is also in a way affecting our capacity to respond. You know, to be honest, humanitarian actors here in Burkina Faso, we have been playing a catch-up game since this crisis started. And now with this coronavirus, it's making everything worse. So that's the biggest challenge that you're dealing with. And then again, it's not only humanitarian that is affected, even the government. If you look at the staff working in those health centers, do they have enough equipment, materials necessary to prevent them, even the PPE, to prevent them from the COVID virus? Are they going to be motivated to work given the risk that they have? So these are the things that we all together, humanitarian actors and the government, we find ourselves in a dilemma, because it's not only affecting one country, Yeah, so that's what I wanted to just add.
Thank you, and that was in many ways going to be my question, but I'll put it back to you again. Sorry about that. My email should have been switched off. I will turn it off now. The scale of the crisis has obviously, coronavirus aside, shocked a lot of people. When I first reported on this story in 2018, everyone told me it was unprecedented. It was. When Sam published a story for us in late 2019, people were saying essentially the same thing. Humanitarians were saying essentially the same thing. Do you feel that now humanitarians are sufficiently on the ground? Remember, you know, this was a development context for quite, well, it was a development context. There was no humanitarian emergency in Burkina Faso beyond some of the kind of climate related things that were happening before. Do you feel humanitarians are now on the ground and geared up with the right coordination structures? Or do you feel like everyone is still constantly playing catch up? You mentioned 900,000 displaced people is in the new humanitarian response plan. That figure presumably goes to the end of the year. What happens if we reach it earlier? Are there enough resources? Is this catch-up game still going on? And do you want to, I'll go back to you, Manenji, and then to you, Jackie. And you're just on mute, Menenji. You're gonna have to switch off mute again.
Okay, thank you very much. I think to be more open and honest about it, we are really playing a catch-up game, because I think starting September, October last year, you know, the figure started doubling up, and the statistics are showing us that the number of IDPs is increasing. At the same time, you know, we had this discussion that we have been doing to say what will happen, you know, with development funding that was in country, because now we are faced with a humanitarian crisis which calls for us to do emergency response, whereas the donors had committed some development funding in Burkina Faso. We didn't get a good positive response from the donors. And then when we look our efforts to fundraise, we have been found wanting both us and also the donors, because if you look at the appeal for 2019, it didn't attract a lot of funding. And this year, even the appeal that we put, we don't know whether we are going also to get more funding. And that's affecting how we are responding to the emergency and to the crisis. And you know, because of the funding that has not been available, it's not even to cover the humanitarian needs of the people in displacement. Yeah, if you look at, for example, Center North, you look at the North and the Sahel, where we have majority of the IDPs, very few humanitarian actors are doing emergency response there. So I think that's where we have a gap, and we need to really put more efforts in ensuring that we improve our way we are responding to the crisis.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask a slightly different question to Jackie, then come to Sam, and after to Siaka. I realize we have a very diverse panel, so it's difficult to work out how to sort of flow between everyone. Jackie, I wanted to ask you a question about the operating environment in Burkina Faso. I'm not sure where you've worked previously, but I wondered how this sort of differs potentially compared to other contexts. It's useful, presumably, for humanitarians to know which armed groups are operating where and who they are. And it seems like though security analysts attribute attack after attack online often to, you know, JNIM or to this is the Al-Qaeda franchise or to Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, there's actually a patchwork of armed groups. Most attacks go unidentified, and I wonder how difficult it is to operate in such a context.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked in I've lost track of how many different countries, but I've worked, I've worked in sub-Saharan Africa, West, East, the Middle East, Northeast Syria. So the contexts, while all different in their own ways, there's similarities. And I would say the operating environment here, where it's the most different and where this has been the most challenging, I think for us, is that for expatriate staff, and that includes basically all expatriate staff, especially in our most vulnerable and most difficult areas of operations, we really have complete remote management. because of the level of control of these non-state armed groups. It's not so much who the groups are. It's not so much, knowing their MO, although we do have a specialist here on the ground who works on, security and access, and it's his job to kind of track and map who's controlling where and what, and have that information for us, because that is essential. But that's not different necessarily than as I mentioned, working in Northeast Syria. We had people doing that there, and we have people doing that in every place that we work, where these non-state armed actors are operating. This is the humanitarian world now. This is the way that we work. These groups are in most of the contexts. I shouldn't say all. They're in most of the contexts in which we work. This is the multivariate crisis context in which we're working. So knowing who is out there, the shifting alliances and the shifting lines is important. It doesn't make Burkina Faso particularly unique in that way. I think what makes Burkina Faso unique is as you mentioned in the beginning, how rapid the deterioration was, how quickly these groups sort of came in, allied themselves, coalesced, moved around, and then also maybe created alliances and factions within local existing tribal conflict. But for us, what's difficult is the extent to which remote management has to occur, and the lack of access from upper management, from senior management, because of the difficulty of the security situation in some of the hardest hit areas.
Thank you very much, Jackie. Sam, similar but different question to you. You came to Burkina Faso from South Sudan. You were the correspondent for the Associated Press and for us as well for a number of years. Tell us a little bit about the differences between these two contexts: the protracted crisis in South Sudan, civil war that gone on for many years, and people used to decades of conflict before that. Compared to Burkina Faso, where everything's a lot newer for people. Tell us a little bit about some of the stories behind the people you're speaking with, how they're coping.
Yeah, so the contexts are, some ways similar, but in many ways very different, right? Like you said, South Sudan was going through a civil war, and before that it had decades of war. So people there were, you could say, hardened by war, used to it. Here, it's very different. It's not a civil war. You have external actors. You also have homegrown militias and intercommunal conflict, but it's largely more of a counterterrorism operation, not a civil war. So the very different in terms of the actual context. The people I speak to, I find here, there's the stories that I've heard and the people I've talked to across the country, there's I'd say like a raw shock. There's a shock, there's an uncertainty, there's this genuine desire, understandably, of course, to want to go back. And I think people are unsure as to how long this is going to last. Where I found in South Sudan, people maybe were just hardened by it, or just like, this is going on and on and on, we just hope it ends. Where here people are thinking, maybe this is going to end soon, and sort of this uncertainty as, what do we do? How do we rebuild our lives? How settled do we get in this new location? Or are we going to be able to go home in a week? People are very emotional, which I didn't find was the same in South Sudan. Not to say that people weren't emotional, but people show that a lot here. And that could be because it's fresh and it's new and it's very different than what they've been used to.
Thanks very much, Sam. Thank you everyone for sending over questions as well. We have a lot of questions to the panelists, some of which I will try and get to, though we're not going to be able to get to all of them, unfortunately. But one to Siaka, from me first, and then another question. One I really wanted to ask you, Siaka, is that, where did I have the question? Here it is. Yeah, in 2014, Blaise Compaoré was chased out of power in an amazing popular uprising.
Yes.
Yeah, can you hear me, Siaka?
Blaise Compaoré has been at the head of the state for 27 years. And in 2014, he was planning to modify the constitution and have a new term as a president of the country. And at that moment, we had the political class who was changing, and the society was also changing with the arrival of many young people on the political ground. And they see that this long staying at the head of the state was not convenient for the democracy. And a fight took place in October 2014. And at the end of the day, the president was compelled to leave the country and to leave the power also. Actually, is residing in Ivory Coast.
Siaka, if I could just ask you, one thing I think is quite an interesting question is, as you said, you've given us a bit more history. Blaise Compaoré was kicked out of power in this popular uprising, and I wonder, with all the crisis now and the sort of all the problems that are happening, are you noticing any kind of increasing desire to see Compaoré and the stability that perhaps he represented in some people's minds return to Burkina Faso as sort of trust in the current president who was elected in 2015, Kaboré, dwindles?
Yes. Blaise Compaoré was the head of the state, and this Kaboré, actually the president of the country, was also a member of his staff. He was he has been a prime minister. He has also been the president of the assembly. And people think generally that the situation has not changed really. And today, part of the people are thinking that Compaoré should come back to the country. And for this, there is a need of a political dialogue which the international community is calling for. But we don't know the will of the actual president to go to this political dialogue. And it's always the way without future.
And Siaka, you mentioned in one of your first answers that what really concerns you is the communal divides that are opening up in Burkina Faso. One of our listeners has asked if you could say a little bit more about how you think some of those communal divisions could be solved. You said that there should be a national dialogue. What is your view on how these wounds might heal?
As you know, the Burkina Faso is a country created by the French colonialists, and they bring together a lot of small groups as a people. But for 60 years, the work of bringing these people to be a nation has not been done. So there were some fractures among the communities, but under the presidency of Compaoré, it was not a big problem because it was a strong, very strong power. And he had a good army keeping the country safe. After him, now the jihadist fight is here. And the presidency actually is thinking that the jihadists are coming from a group, an ethnical group, which is the Fulani, and thinking that the Fulani group is willing to take the power in Burkina Faso. That is why the people from the Mosi ethnical group are trying to defend themselves, and they used to kill the Fulani people. And we think that this community fracture is a very deep one, and it will be a good way that the humanitarian say that the community, the international community, should come to see the situation in Burkina Faso. Otherwise, we will have a very big collapse of this country as a failed state. And
quick question for you, Jackie, following up on that. aid agencies that have arrived and that are present in the country largely geared towards emergency response? Is anyone thinking about peace building, development, and also, you know, things like this, community reconciliation initiatives? We actually have a question about the triple nexus as well. I won't ask you about that, but yeah, is anyone going beyond emergency response?
I mean, certainly there are actors that are going beyond emergency response. Certainly there are NGOs that have been here for decades that were doing development programming before the humanitarian crisis happened, and I think are continuing to do that programming where it's appropriate, even during the crisis. Look, just because a crisis happens doesn't mean that development programming isn't needed, and I think that we can just not use the nexus terminology. It's one of those words that it's a great idea, but it has to have meaning behind it. But in terms of what it really means, or what that can really mean, is just simply the idea that, you know, these things don't occur in silos, and it doesn't occur as a linear progression, right? You can have an emergency that happens and then a transition to a slightly more peaceful time where programming like governance, I can't speak, I'm very sorry. Resilience programming, transitional programming can occur, but then we also have to be limber and ready to respond when the crisis kicks up again, if it kicks up again. And I think that's truly what the spirit behind the idea of something like Nexus is. And certainly there are NGOs here that are doing that, and the International Rescue Committee has every intention to implement programming in that direction. We're a bit of a new kid on the block here, just in that way we've been on the ground here in Burkina Faso for less than a year. So all of our programming is geared towards the humanitarian response, but globally, we do look at resilience programming and transitional programming. So certainly I think that is the plan. It's just a matter of making sure that it's being done responsibly, and also, very importantly, making sure that funding for that is accessible. I think this is something that my colleague, Dr. Menenji, mentioned earlier. One of the things that's been a challenge is really being able to draw funding that allows us to access both of these things at the same time, when and where necessary. Just because there's a crisis happening in one part of the country doesn't mean that education isn't needed in another. So, you know, as an example, that's kind of what has been one of the larger challenges, is getting that to be understood, that these things can and do co-occur, and the response needs to also be co-occurrent, basically. So.
Menenji, do you have any thoughts on any of that? And thank you, Jackie. And yeah.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. For NRC, I think it's the same. Having arrived, you know, basically our mandate is now focusing on emergency response, which is more humanitarian, and then maybe look at some durable solutions. But at the moment, I think it's for us as NRC, whilst we are putting in place some strategy for durable solutions, but honestly, at the moment, what is key is the emergency response, because we have so much huge humanitarian needs in Burkina Faso. We will not to suffice that. What we have seen again is, I think if you look at the scale of the armed conflict at the moment, I think it will be a big challenge to see how we can actually intertwine, you know, emergency response as well as development activities. Because I want to give an example. If you look around those areas like Jibo, Aribinda, going to Dori, where there are so much, where there are so much, these are the much more targeted areas. It's, you know, most of the NGOs that have been doing development, you find that they've sort of like pulled back, you know, take a step back to see if there's an improvement in security, and then they can continue with the development projects. And then again, in country, maybe Siakam may be able to come in, is that we have seen a tendency where the international community, the regional bloc, they've been calling for more support, you know, on the military interventions. more than on understanding the underlying causes of this crisis and trying to understand from the people that are affected what are the real issues. So by doing that, it's like we have failed to address the key issues coming up. I think, when people are really disgruntled, they are not happy, they can support whoever they want to support. And then, that's creation of the vacuum in development in those areas may have contributed maybe to what we are seeing. So for us, I think those long-standing inequalities and grievances, needs to be understood, and then the government should look at addressing them. I think that may also help. So I think, yes, whilst we are talking about Nexus, yes, but yeah, like Jackie said, we really need to see the meaning and how and re-strategize how to do it in those affected communities.
Thank you very much. Too much militarization, not enough emphasis on humanitarian needs, and the local drivers of conflict seems to be a criticism that a lot of analysts and humanitarians have right now in Burkina Faso. Sam, there was a question that I'd like you to address if you can. Siaka was talking about some of the divides that have opened up between the Pearl Fulani community and the majority and the Mossi community, who are the majority ethnic group in Burkina Faso. There is this self-defense group called the Kogloiego, who have been around for a while, a sort of crime-fighting militia who are now sort of getting sucked into conflict, and they are sort of a majority Mossi group. And one of our audience members is wondering what role you think the Kogloiego are likely to play going forward. Maybe you could speak to that and this new civilians law that has been introduced by the government. And we don't have too long, just to put the pressure on you.
I'll be brief and concise, or try to. So, right, the Kogloiego, I think a lot of people have applauded a lot of community locals have applauded their ability to reduce petty crime. People said their motorbikes are stolen less. They feel like there's a bit more law and order in parts where the police or the army years ago and now weren't able to do that. However, there have been many reports of human rights abuses by the Kogloiego, disproportionate use of force when they're trying to discipline someone, and reports of targeting communities such as the Fulani and attacks and revenge attacks. So the Kogloiego have wanted to be recognized by the government and armed by them for years. Now the government has recently approved a new law which will arm community volunteers, and that is to help in this fight against these extremists. This doesn't include the Kogloiego. It doesn't specifically include them. And so I think there's some feelings that this could either embolden them, the Kogloiego, or undermine them, which would potentially make them very upset. Either way, you're going to have what's being created is another layer of violence, where you're having the potential for that, where you're having many different groups armed around the country. There's already, from what people say, lack of oversight, human rights abuses. So you're just adding to this mix that some people have called a recipe for disaster. So in terms of the influence of the Kogloiego, I think at this point it's a bit unclear, but there's definitely a lot more people with arms that will be circulating around the country. And I think there's questions about oversight and accountability.
Thank you, Sam. And Sam did an excellent piece for us looking at the vigilantes, the civilian volunteers law a couple of weeks ago. So do check that out on the new Humanitarian website. We are running out of time, but I did want to ask one more question to Siaka that has come in from a listener. It is a very kind of big question that is probably completely unsuitable to be the last question in such a panel, but I'm going to ask it anyway because it's a good question. Siaka, it's fairly well known that Blaise Compaoré's network had different sort of connections with armed Islamist groups, and that might have played a role in reducing the possibility of attacks in Burkina Faso's territory prior to 2014. Do you think the fall of Compaoré, what role do you think the fall of Compaoré played in creating this insurgency? And do you think Burkina Faso would be suffering from this crisis with or without him?
Yeah, it's a quite difficult question. From my side, I can't say Blaise Compaoré has some operational relation with the terrorist groups. what we can say is that when he was in power, there were no attack on Burkina Faso. And now, when he is no more in power, we have this attack. So some people are saying that he can be behind the terrorist attacks on Burkina Faso. But personally, I don't believe in this theory. And because he has also his people being attacked by these terrorist groups. And like the mayor of Djibo has been killed by terrorist group, he is from this, the party of Blaise Compaoré. And also, Blaise Compaoré offered his help to the current president, saying that he has some experience of the fight against the terrorism, and he can be of some help. He can help him to fight with them, but the president has not accepted. So this question is like a discussion people can have among themselves, but we don't have evidence of this link between Blaise Compaoré and the terrorist groups. What I can also say is that the terrorist situation is a general situation in the Sahel. We have 5 countries concerned by this situation. We have Mauritania, we have Mali, you have Niger, you have Chad and Burkina Faso. So I don't believe Blaise Compaoré can coordinate all this situation. And also some foreign armies are on the ground, like France, like also the USA, and the people, the soldiers has been killed by the terrorists, but they have the means to know that Blaise Compaoré is not or is in link with the terrorist group. If it was the case, I think the USA would have designated the Blaise Compaoré as a part of the terrorist movement, but from now they don't have, they have not said it, and we don't think that this is a reality.
Okay, thank you very much, Siaka. I'm going to ask another question, and if we run over, Jackie, I think you need to leave, so please feel free to do that. And thank you so much for joining us. A quick question to Manenji, the last question, which is coming from one of our readers, which is a question about COVID-19 and possibilities of, this is something we've picked up on in Central African Republic and in Ethiopia and in a few other places, issues about stigmatization of Western aid workers with respect to COVID-19, feeling that potentially this is being brought in by outsiders and that impacting aid operations and impacting Western aid workers. Is that something that's happening in Burkina Faso, something you're worried about? Just need you to take off the mute button.
Yes, yeah. Maybe Jackie can also help answer that question. But for me, based on the feedback that we are having from the fields, with the teams and so forth, I have not yet get that message coming through. So far, I think. To be honest, I think even in my teams again, because I'm also covering Niger, I've asked them also to keep on tracking those messaging. I've not yet got anything. I don't know whether Jackie, we have heard any at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a concern. It's obviously something that we're keeping an eye on because we don't want to be naive or caught off guard. But similar to Dr. Manenji, we haven't experienced this. We don't have any reports of this as of yet. And in the most delicate way possible, we're tracking that with the teams. We're seeing if there's any sort of anti-Western sentiment that's being, specifically brought out or brought to anyone's attention. Thus far, it has not been an issue. So we are watching that. We are aware that it could happen, but it's not on our radar as a top concern at this moment.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, everyone who sent in questions. We can't unfortunately get to all of them, but we will look at all of them and think about how many we can throw to Sam to write fuller stories for in the coming weeks and months. So Siaka, thank you. You mentioned, that the crisis would have come regardless of Blaise Compaoré or anyone else, that this is a real problem. You all mentioned that this was a worsening crisis. Sam mentioned the proliferation of weapons. Siaka mentioned his particular concern about increasing communal grievances. Menenji spoke about the fact that the local grievances underlying the conflict are barely being addressed. And both our humanitarians, Jackie and Menenji, talked about their fears over the sheer scale and rapidity of the crisis. So thank you very much for everyone for listening. Thank you to the panel for joining us this afternoon. And good luck, and yeah, good luck with the preparations and with the efforts to combat the spread of COVID-19. And we will continue reporting on that and continue reporting on the crisis, broader crisis in Burkina Faso in the weeks and months to come. So do follow our work and check out what we've published already. And yeah, thank you to the panelists and to our listeners alike, and everyone stay safe. Thank you very much.